This is a MiSTer. So, what does that mean? Well, MiSTer is an operating system for the DE10 Nano FPGA development board that can be used to deploy retro cores to the FPGA. That probably doesn't help at all, does it? An FPGA is a computer chip that has a big array of generic logic gates and a means of programming it with configurations that connect those logic gates in various ways to reproduce other computer hardware. In our case, specifically, retro CPUs and other retro circuitry. Specifically of interest to us right now is the AO486 core, which attempts to replicate a 486 Intel processor and the other various things like sound cards that were typical parts of DOS PCs in the 1980s and 1990s in order to play retro DOS games on it. And today, we are going to be looking at this CD. This is the Ultima Collection CD that was released sometime in the mid to late 90s, probably as part of the promotion for Ultima 9, and it contains copies of all of the classic Ultima games, plus Ultima 8. And we are going to do our best to run everything on this CD on the MiSTer and see how well it works and what it takes to configure it. So, let us begin. I have here an install of DOS 6.22 on a virtual hard drive on my MiSTer. There are virtual hard drives you can get out there with a bunch of games pre-installed on them, including the Ultima games. I don't really want a hard drive full of 300 DOS games on my MiSTer. I just want a handful, so I prefer to do this manually. I also tried to do this with FreeDOS, since that is just a more accessible and better OS, but a lot of the Ultima games, for some reason, I was not able to get to boot on here. DOS 6.22 worked fine with minimal configuration, so that is what I'm going to be using right now. So, first thing I want to do, that's kind of an ugly boot. That high-mem memory test takes forever. There is no reason for it. Let us get rid of it. All you have to do is add testmem off in the high-mem command line there. I'm also going to go into autoexec.bat, move echo off to the top, so I don't have that smart drive command line showing up every time I boot. Control-Alt-Delete, and we get a much cleaner boot. So, next thing we need to do is copy the games from the Ultima Collection CD onto the virtual hard drive. So I'm going to mount the CD here. I do have a CD image of it that I've made. Go to the D drive, and DOS has no idea what a D drive is. That is because MS-DOS 6.22 did not have CD drivers natively. You had to install them from the device manufacturer. So, somehow we have to get CD drivers onto the MiSTer. How are we going to do that? There are a few ways, but what I'm going to be doing is using a utility called MiSTer FS to copy files off of the MiSTer's SD card into the DOS VHD. There is a floppy image containing the MiSTer FS utility that you can get on the MiSTer forum. I will try to link that somewhere in the video description. We do that, and we do in fact have an A drive. I will make a utility directory on C, and copy the MiSTer FS utility there. With that done, we can eject this floppy image. We no longer need that. So in order to use the MiSTer FS utility, you need to tell it what drive letter you want, so all you need to do is run the program and give it the drive letter as an argument, and it will just go ahead and map it. Nothing much to it. The folder that it maps is in your AO486 Games folder, the shared subdirectory there are discussions on the forums about how to set that up. So what I'm going to do is copy from the new E drive oakcdrom.sys was a pretty universal standard CD-ROM driver back in the day. And I'm going to copy that to my utils directory. There it is. And we need to actually make DOS load that driver. So, first of all, in config.sys, not sure why that didn't start last time, we will use device high to load this into high memory, I believe. We give it the path to that device driver, and we tell it what device it should be using for the CD driver. I believe MSCD001 is an OS path to the CD-ROM device of some kind. That's not enough, though. We also need to go into autoexec.bat. We need to use this DOS utility called mscdex that I believe loads or mounts a CD device as a DOS drive. We tell it what the hardware address of that CD is. That's that same mscd001 string we used before. We tell it with /L what the drive letter is. We want it to be on drive D. So with those changes, we Control-Alt-Delete DOS, and if we give it a moment, we should see that CD-ROM driver loading, meaning we still have the CD mounted. We now have access to the Ultima Collection CD. So I'm going to copy these into a UC folder on the C drive, just to keep them a little better organized. I will be using xcopy as a way of copying entire folders at once. Do make sure you use the /E command line option here. That tells it that it should copy any subdirectories in that folder as well. Let's see. Let us make the working directory UC. One thing that will happen here is you have to tell it that the place you want to copy it to is a directory, not a file. There is a way around that, though. As long as you put a / at the end of the target folder name, that will tell xcopy that is definitely a folder, and it should be treated as one. And that reduces the number of keystrokes you have to do. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all the rest of the Ultima games over and come back to you when I'm done with that. I will point out that when you get to Ultima 6, there is actually a subfolder there that needs to be copied. If you don't copy that, you will not have a working copy of Ultima 6. So that is why you need to make sure you use that /E option. Okay, with that done, we now have a whole bunch of Ultima games on our C drive, meaning we no longer need our... that unmount. There we go, we no longer need that CD mounted. So, now let's actually begin running these games. Starting at the very beginning, because that is a very good place to start, with Ultima 1. And it just starts up fine. Ultima 1 on the Ultima Collection CD is, by the way, I believe the Ultima Trilogy version of Ultima 1. It's a slightly updated version that was released with the next 2 Ultima games in a package. Probably the only DOS port of Ultima 1 that was ever made. We just make some character. And we are in game. Let's see if I can find a monster to demonstrate combat. You will notice that it seems like that's probably running a little bit fast. Well, AO486 does have... If I can navigate the menu properly. It does have options for CPU speed. 90 MHz is the default. You can also do 15, 30, or 56. I have no idea if those map cleanly to actual Intel CPU speeds or not, but that is the labels the options are given. So let us try running this at 15 MHz. I tend to find that I need to actually restart AO486 to make these things start up cleanly. If I just try to change them at runtime, they don't always run at the speed you would get from a fresh boot, so I'm going to actually do a core reset here every time I change the CPU speed, just to be sure I'm getting an accurate speed. You will notice, I think, with that, it takes a little longer for that CD-ROM driver to load, unfortunately. But that does slow down the Origin logo quite a bit there. So we are moving in the right direction. That still seems pretty fast, though, just going by the sound effects. But another thing we can do here is, I believe just this past year, AO486 was extended to have support for Level 1 and Level 2 CPU cache, which greatly improved its performance. Unfortunately, in these very old Ultima games, we don't always want the best performance, so what we are actually going to do is turn off some of this caching behavior. What actually works the best for me is to turn off the Level 1 cache only, leave the Level 2 cache on. If you turn them both off, it runs at a completely unrealistic crawl. If you keep Level 1 on but not Level 2, it still runs quite a bit too fast, I think, so the configuration I'm going to be using for Ultima 1 for this demo is 15 MHz, no Level 1 cache, yes Level 2 cache. And with that, we will reset and apply the settings. And here we go. The PC speaker effects are at least reasonable. And the combat sounds are not terrible. So I think that's a pretty reasonable setting to run Ultima 1 with. Something I will point out is that the Ultima Collection CD, aware that these games would not run very well on fancy new PCs in the late 90s, they shipped all of the games with a utility called moslow.com. You can see there in the middle of the listing. That is basically a way of artificially slowing down the CPU speed to run these games better. Which you basically tell it what % of total speed you want it to run at, and pass the name of the executable. Unfortunately, if I do that, it seems to make the PC speaker sounds in Ultima 1 and all the other Ultima games kind of strange sounding. I assume there is some bug in AO486 that makes it not continue to update the speaker while MoSlow is doing whatever it does to slow down the CPU. I don't know why. I think just running 15 MHz, no Level 1 cache, is good enough, MoSlow or not. So let us move on to Ultima 2. I am still running with the same settings I just talked about, 15 MHz, no level 1 cache. And we get very authentic Apple II graphics ported to DOS. And with a character created, that is some pretty fast-moving water. Even with these settings, Ultima 2 seems to run really fast to me, probably unrealistically fast. Unfortunately, I don't think there is any good way of running it any slower than this. Again, if I turn off both the level 1 and level 2 cache, it runs entirely too slow and not very realistic. I'd like to find some monsters to demonstrate combat, but of course they're not going to spawn when I'm looking for them. So it's not amazing, but I think that's the best we're going to get for Ultima 2 on the MiSTer right now. So Ultima 3. Running with the same settings and just going by the speed of the intro screen here, and the little dragon fighting animation that's about to start, this seems like a reasonable set of settings. Sorry about that. The animation on the intro screen seems a little bit fast, I think. But again, I don't think there's too much we can do to improve upon that. Ultima 3 is unique for being one of the very, very few games at the time or ever that let you create a character whose sex is other. Very, very progressive, and I wish more Ultima games and more games at all had done that. You have to do a lot to get a party started in Ultima 3, but once you get into game, it seems to play pretty reasonably at these settings. I'm not going to get any monsters spawned, am I? So, to demonstrate combat, we will just kill Chuckles. Yeah, if I had my way, it would probably run a little bit slower than that, but it's okay. So, Ultima 4. The animation seems pretty smooth here, not too fast. Unfortunately, we lose our option to be other here, so whatever. Now, as you go through this intro, there are some load times. Using the no level 1 cache setting, those seem to be a little bit long to me. It may be representative of how this would have been on a contemporary computer, I don't know, but This is probably about the time where it would be a good idea to start turning the level 1 cache back on, though. So if I turn that back on and run at just a normal 15 megahertz setting, the load times during the intro are pretty tolerable, I think. I'm just going to mash A and start as a mage here, because that's what you do. And honesty is the best anyway. Once you get into game with this setting, the animation on the characters here does look a little fast, though, so this may be faster than you would like for an authentic experience. The sound effects seem basically fine, though. So, it is what it is. Maybe just a matter of taste, how much you're willing to tolerate slowness for authenticity. Ultima 5 is definitely the best of the Ultima games. No argument. And that really doesn't sound quite right. Once again, let's mash through the intro and see how gameplay looks. Don't need that. Again, the animation looks a little fast, but reasonable. And I think if you run this in DOSBox default settings, that is basically what the animation looks like anyway. But more importantly, the speaker sound effects do not sound right at all. And that is actually a bug in the BIOS used with AO486, I believe. As far as I understand it, traditional DOS BIOSes would always beep the speaker during initialization, and Ultima 5's code probably relies on the speaker being beeped and setting the interrupt timers in the DOS motherboard to a good, usable value. Since the AO486 BIOS doesn't do that, then it ends up making strange, not good speaker effects. So, how do we go about fixing that? The advice I got on the MiSTer forums is that you can use the DOS debug utility, which basically allows you to poke things into memory and do other interesting things. What I want to do here is type O43B6. I believe that is going to poke the value B6 into output port 43. Those are hexadecimal values. I think port 43 is one of those interrupt timers. I'm not sure which one. We do that, then we type Q to leave debug. That whoosh sound sounds a lot more reasonable now. And when we journey onward, we get pretty reasonable sounding PC speaker effects in-game here as well. So if one is playing Ultima 5, one is going to need that workaround for the speaker effects. Another thing you can do is there is a patched BIOS on the MiSTer forums that at least allows you, if you type Echo Control G or fill the keyboard buffer or something, that will make the speaker beep. I believe if you beep the speaker that way, or if you have any other means of making the speaker beep, it should make the speaker effects in Ultima 5 work okay. Unfortunately, the default BIOS does not support that method. But anyway, that said, let us move along to Ultima 6. Now, Ultima 6 was the first of the Ultima games that had built-in support for sound cards. In this case, just MIDI music, but that does mean that we need to run an installation program to tell it how to use the sound card we have installed. So Ultima 6 has an install program that is shipped with it. It doesn't matter what you tell it here, I don't think. We definitely want VGA graphics. We do not have a Microsoft-compatible mouse because mouse interface is dumb. We do need to tell it that the MiSTer has an AdLib card installed, and it is installed at the default port address. And with those settings, Ultima 6's music seems to work fine for me. And we are going to start a new character. I believe you actually have to do this because the one that comes on the Ultima Collection disc is corrupt. But with that done, we can just go into Ultima 6. And we should be hearing MIDI music here. Lovely. I am just going to skip through this because it's long. Here we actually have portraits for the first time. They are 90s-tastic portraits, but I appreciate having a white-haired, probably elderly woman as an option, so we will be using that one. Now, the Gypsy here has an animation that takes quite a while. And what is going on with her arm when she gets that one on the far left? And this is where the 15 MHz setting starts to seem a little bit slow. You can definitely turn this up and get a more pleasant gameplay experience. However, I know that for realistic timing on speedrun.com for this game, they do recommend DOSBox settings that are pretty close to this slow anyway, so if you are going for authenticity, this may be the setting you want. .30 MHz would be a nice compromise for this game, I think, but when I try to run at 30 MHz, for some reason, the core just hangs on me. I'm not sure why. That seems to be true of all the Ultima games I've tested it with. So the next option I found that actually worked was 56 MHz, which feels pretty smooth, but might be a little too fast for authenticity. I don't know. You will note that Ultima 6 does still have those PC speaker sound effects. If you had not done previously that fix that I did for Ultima 5, you would not be hearing those correctly. So make sure you do that when you start Ultima 6 as well if you want proper PC speaker effects. I think if you Control-Alt-Delete, the fix will continue to work, but if you reboot the core, it will stop working. If you want it permanent, there is a way I was advised to use to get it into your autoexec.bat. I am going to make a text file here in my utils folder. With those same debug commands that I typed earlier. And then if I go into my autoexec.bat, I can say debug using the stream redirection operators to send the contents of that file into the debug. And tell it to discard the output. And theoretically, if I now restart and launch Ultima 5 or 6, then we should get working PC speaker effects at every boot. And it seems fine. You may be wondering if that same issue affects any of the other Ultima games, or any of the earlier Ultima games we've already looked at, and as far as I can tell, it doesn't, with one exception. Ultima 2, you may have noticed, there was no walking sound effect. Unfortunately, that fix does not actually apply to Ultima 2 for some reason. Ultima 2 seems to have some other strange behavior with that specific sound effect, and the only means I found to actually make the walk sound happen in Ultima 2 was to run Ultima 3 first. For some reason, that sound you get on the main menu there, if you hear that, and then you launch Ultima 2, you start getting walk sounds. It doesn't sound great because I'm still running with the level 1 cache enabled, but that is, I guess, a thing you can do if you really want the optimal Ultima 2 experience, but the optimal Ultima 2 experience is really not playing Ultima 2, so we will leave it at that. Moving on, let's look at Ultima 7 here. There is an install program we need to run once again. So here, we do actually want a Sound Blaster. This is a proper Sound Blaster that the MiSTer does support. 220 is fine. We do need to change our IRQ to 5, though. As far as I can tell, that's the way that the Sound Blaster is configured by default on the MiSTer. At least that is what works for me on the Ultima games. And we should be not okay on memory. So what we need to do to address that is just comment out the CD driver that we started up earlier. By not loading the CD driver, we should have enough memory to run Ultima 7 successfully. Now, to me, this intro seems to be running really slowly at 15 MHz, so that probably isn't a good option. In my opinion, this is a good time just to go all the way to 90 MHz. That seems to be pretty consistent with the expected speed of the game. And I do believe that on speedrun.com, the recommended DOSBox settings for Ultima 7 are about 4 times as fast as the recommended ones for Ultima 6, so that probably corresponds to the difference between a 15 MHz and 90 MHz AO486 core. And by doing that, this butterfly animation at the beginning seems a lot smoother to me.
Avatar! Know that Britannia has entered into a new age of enlightenment.
And know that Sound Blaster support is properly configured. But here we have, if I can change it, only 2 portraits, both of which are generic blonde people. Whatever. And for the first time in the series, we have loading screens. Hooray! And I'm just going to point out here that if you continue running Ultima 7 without a mouse connected, YOLO actually yells at you and tells you to go get a mouse. So I'm going to do that and be right back. Okay, I have plugged a mouse into my MiSTer here. In order to actually use it in anything in AO486, though, we do need to install a mouse driver in DOS. It doesn't have one by default. The most common thing to use is something called Qt Mouse, a more modern mouse driver, I think. I am once again going to activate my MiSTer FS. And copy the ctmouse.exe driver file into my utils folder. If I can type properly. All you need to do is add the executable directly to autoexec.bat. You don't need any arguments or anything, and that should give us mouse support. And there we actually have a mouse pointer. And once we get into game here, we have mouse support as well. Female avatar, by the way, apparently dresses like Sailor Moon in Ultima 7. Go figure. Anyway, let us move on. The Ultima Collection CD also includes Serpent Isle, which was the sequel to Ultima 7 2, as it were. It is basically the same engine, newish plot. Again, we cannot go directly to the end game, but we do need to run the installer. As before, 220, 5IRQ. Should have plenty of memory still. And we seem to have working audio.
My liege. All we found among Battlin's belongings was this enchanted scroll, and a map showing the way to a place called the Serpent Isle.
Indeed. Put it on the table.
You do not sound even remotely British there. I wonder if Lord British did his own voice acting in this game or not. I suspect he probably did, but I don't know for sure. Anyway, I think if you try to boot Serpent Isle without mouse connected, it just refuses to boot for you. We have a mouse, so we are fine. We have the same blonde avatar as before, but this time we actually can change, and we can have brunettes and even black people. Which is a little better than the original Ultima 7, I guess. And the loading screen is now blue. That's great. So as you can see, the engine is basically the same as Ultima 7.1. The avatar still has the same Sailor Moon outfit. New to Serpent Isle, though, you can actually see the character portraits change as you add and remove equipment. Meaning we can finally have the experience of taking off YOLO's pants. On that note, let us move on. Ultima 8 is a game that exists. Let me see. We do have to install it. It has a fancy, higher resolution DOS font, apparently. We still use Sound Blaster, 220, and 5IRQ. I think the default DMA is fine. I think we do the same for the music. Okay, one thing we do have to do here is that we need to change the number of maximum file handles in the config.sys. So we will do that. Just set it to 40, that's fine. And we do have to reboot after doing that. Boo, hiss.
You have been a thorn in my side for far too long, Avatar. Your two worlds will be crushed.
It's 3D, it's so fancy!
Then Earth. I shall parade you before their conquered peoples as the fallen idol of a
But whatever. I don't think we get any character creation whatsoever in Ultima 8 besides entering a name. We always end up with the same generic blonde guy for the avatar. I know absolutely nothing about Ultima 5 or Ultima 8, so I can't say too much about it here, but apparently you can walk into the fire and turn around slowly, and most infamously, whee, you can jump. Slowly. And run into trees. Whatever. So that is all the Ultima games that are on the Ultima Collection CD, except for one. Akalabeth, Richard Garriott's first published RPG, sometimes considered Ultima Zero because of some continuity with the rest of the Ultima series, is also on here. So, let us see what that very, very early game does on the MiSTer. It will probably run entirely too fast and be unplayable, but For some reason there is a setup program in there, but I don't think we need that. Let us just run it. AK. And nothing happens. The AO486 core actually crashes trying to run that version of Akalabeth from the Ultima Collection CD. And I believe the reason for that is that this is a re-release of Akalabeth that was done specifically for Ultima Collection, probably the only DOS port that had ever been done of the game. And as you can see from the folder there are some fancy things like MIDI music and a setup utility and whatever else. So it was probably done doing pretty modern development techniques as a port. So what you can do is you can try to run this in a Windows 95 environment on the MiSTer, and if you do that, you actually get a more useful exception trace on the result when you try to run it, and what it tells you that there is no floating point coprocessor found on the MiSTer, because AO486 does not implement an FPU. It boggles the mind that Akalabeth, which was written in like 1982, would need an FPU, but apparently it does. Probably just because whoever made this DOS port linked in standard libraries that assumed FPU support, because it was probably 1997, 1998 when they did that. And if you look at the README in that folder, there's a bit of discussion to that point. Basically saying that this is the only conversion ever made done to promote Ultima 9. And whatever else. There is a version of Akalabeth on GOG.com that is actually a different version of the game, and it does in fact run. I have a copy of that GOG Akalabeth, or Akalabeth, in my shared folder here. I'm just going to bring that over. You will notice that this is just what looks like a basic program, probably the original source code plus a basic interpreter would be my guess. And you can kind of read the basic code here if you really, really want to. But this version, it does not have any of the MIDI support or any of the fancy setup program that the Ultima Collection version of Akalabeth had, but it does actually run. And you can enter Akalabeth, World of Doom, if you really, really want to. Whatever. I don't know how to play Akalabeth. I am not going to mess with it too much right now. So, that basically covers what I wanted to do today. I am personally quite excited about the MiSTer. I think it's a really good unit for use with retro gaming, especially for things like DOS and other PCs that, besides DOSBox, there really are not a lot of good options for playing those games, especially with the reliability you need for something like speedrunning these days. Thank you for watching, and have a beautiful evening.